What is construction? Construction forms part of the foundation of fashion design. It is the stage where the designer transforms the two-dimensional sketch or pattern into a three-dimensional garment. This lesson will take you through all the stages of construction, which will provide you with a strong foundation and starting point wherefrom you can start your sewing career. Hi designers, I hope you are all doing well. Thank you for joining another fashion-filled lesson. Our quote for today is, "The challenges are part of the reason why it is so rewarding to sew a garment and be able to say, 'I made that.'" Today's objectives are to explain the purpose of fabric ratings, to select the appropriate technique for fabrics, to identify different parts of a garment, to recall the construction process, and to analyze garments to determine the order of construction. Welcome to lesson 3, titled The Art of Construction. This lesson is going to be so much fun. See what I did there? So much fun. You are probably thinking, why are we learning about cutting a pattern out? It is easy, you just pin and cut, right? Wrong. To cut out a pattern takes time and it takes patience. It takes time to create the best layout that works with the design, but that is also economical. It takes time to cut out the pattern and to mark all of the pattern pieces. Marking, as you should know by now, should provide better results than constructing a garment without markings, as it won't be as accurate. It is also important to pay attention to the rating of the fabric, which you will need when it comes to costing the garment. So, what is the first step when it comes to cutting out the fabric? Before you cut your pattern out of your beautiful fabric, there are a few things you need to determine first by inspecting the fabric. Always pre-wash the fabric. This way you will avoid shrinkage of the garment and get rid of any harmful chemical residues left over from the manufacturing of the fabric. You also need to press the fabric to further shrink it and to get rid of any creases. Determine the direction of the fabric. So for this one, you need to determine if the fabric has a nap, which way the pattern is, and which side is the face of the fabric. And last but not least, is the selvage straight or does it bubble and pull? If it is not straight, you need to make small nips in the selvage to straighten the edge out. Another step before pinning the pattern to the fabric is to determine whether you are going to create a single or a double layout. The double layout is the most common layout used when cutting out patterns because we generally only create half of the pattern, right? This is why some pattern pieces will be cut on the fold like a front bodice or cut out twice like a sleeve. To create a double layout, you need to fold the fabric in half and place the selvages on each other. If the fabric does not have a specific direction due to a pattern or a nap, you can place the pattern in any direction or mix it up to create the most economical layout. Now the single layout is not folded in half, which means if you want to use this layout, you need to make sure that you have transferred or traced the other side of the pattern that would have been placed on fold. So you open the pattern as you can see on the image. This is sometimes a more economical layout, especially if you are layering fabric and cutting out multiples of a pattern. This is how they usually cut out patterns for mass production. We have gone through this a while back, but I just want to go through it again because it is super important. How do we place our patterns on the fabric? Well, we follow the grain line, right? Fabric is woven using yarn going in the warp direction, so lengthwise, and yarn going in the weft direction, so across the fabric. How we cut the pattern out of the fabric will significantly influence the fit and how the garment hangs on the body. So let's quickly go through the grains again. The straight grain. This is the most common grain because it is considered the strongest grain. When placing the pattern pieces on this grain, it will be parallel to the selvage as you can see on the image. The cross grain. When you place the pattern pieces on this grain, it is at a 90-degree angle to the selvage as you can see. These are generally used when you want to create a decorative effect. A good example of this is to place a circle skirt on the cross grain because it uses most of the width of the fabric. And then we get the bias grain. For a bias cut, pattern pieces are placed at a 45-degree angle to the selvage. Even though this will use the most fabric, it folds and drapes beautifully around the body. The way you go about placing the pattern pieces on the correct grain line is also super important because it is not something you measure with your eye. Once you have determined which grain line to place the pattern on, you need to use a ruler to make sure that the fabric is lying parallel to the selvage. It is important to measure from the top of the grain line and from the bottom of the grain line outwards towards the selvage and shift or move the pattern until it is laid correctly. This is another time where a clear grid ruler comes in handy as you can use it for all the different grain lines. We all know patterns can turn any ordinary design into something quite remarkable, but how do we create the perfect layout so that everything lines up? The truth is the layout will be a time-consuming process, but it is totally worth it in the end. Let's look at some types of prints and how to create the best layout. Let's look at stripes first. The type of stripe is irrelevant. It does not matter the thickness or the orientation. You will follow the same process of marking and layout for your patterns. Place one pattern piece like a bodice on the fabric and pin it to the fabric, making sure that it is on the correct grain line. Mark the stripe position on the other pattern pieces that is joined with the first piece, and use these marks to determine the layout of the pattern pieces. What do we do with patterns all over? A fabric with an all-over pattern generally has a repeated design. Now, designs that are smaller, like a Liberty print fabric, is easier to work with and does not require pattern matching, but large designs require placing the pattern in the same way as you would place stripes to ensure that the pattern matches up. Fabrics with a print, scalloped or embroidered border along the selvage creates an incredible effect. Because the border is on the straight grain, you would want the border to be on the hem of the garment, so you need to place the pattern on the cross grain as you can see in the image. Guys, fabric rating is so important, especially if you want to sell your garments. Do you remember what the definition for this term rating is? The term fabric rating refers to the amount of fabric needed to construct one garment, so the fabric consumption for that garment. To work out the consumption of the fabric used for a garment, you need to measure the layout from point A to point B. The open space that you can see on your screen where the circle is would be considered wastage. That is why you need to create the best economical layout as possible. Once you have the amount used in centimeters, you can work out the cost of your garment. Now this we will go through in the next lesson, so don't worry about that now. But this is how you would determine your rating. You measure from point A to point B. Let's take a quick look at the form on your screen. Now this is an example of a cutting sheet, and it's quite handy to have it by your side when you are cutting out your garment. As you can see, you have the name of the design. In my case, it is a mini skirt with a front yoke. You have the date, let's say it's the 27th of March, 1985. You have your fabric swatch. Now I will make this out of 100% cotton twill, and I've also added that it costs me $8 per meter. This will help me work out how much fabric I've used and determine the price of the garment at the end. Then you also have your cutting instructions. There it says I need to cut 1 size medium skirt and also how long it has taken me to cut that pattern out. And then you have the rating, and you can't really see, but it says I've used 80 centimeters or 0.8 meters for the skirt by 1.5 meters, which will be the width of my fabric. Now this cutting template is available in your bonus content tab for you to use when you are creating your garments and to keep by your side when you are working out the costings of your final garment, so your final selling price. The key to a successful garment is the appropriate fabric used during the construction phase. The designer needs to know the properties of fabrics and how best to use them when it comes to design, cutting and constructing the garment. We have gone through the fabric properties in Module 2, Lesson 6, but a recap is always good. The properties that you need to consider when designing and constructing a garment are performance, structure, stretch, weight, drape, and volume. So performance refers to the fabric in relation to its function. So am I making a bridal gown or am I making swimwear? Depending on the performance of the garment, it will influence the type of fabric you buy. Structure refers to the construction of the fabric, which will also influence the weight, look, and feel of the fabric and the garment. Stretch is a type of fabric structure that allows the garment to fit the body without the use of any tailoring techniques such as dart manipulation and tailoring. Weight refers to the thickness of the fabric, and we can make use of light, medium, and heavyweight fabrics. This will influence the drape. Now, the drape of the fabric, depending on your design, will require a high drape or a low drape fabric, and this will influence how the fabric will hang on the body. And then we have volume. Now, volume refers to the shape of the garment and the amount of space that it takes up. So a full circle skirt, for example, will be more voluminous than a half circle skirt. But a full circle skirt in a lightweight material will not take up as much space as a full circle skirt in a heavyweight material because it will hang differently. It is important to analyze your design and consider the characteristics of the fabric properties when determining the appropriate fabric for your design, as it may influence the final look and also the fit of the garment. Let's look at this design. Take a second to study it. Which fabrics do you think is the most appropriate for the design? Chiffon, a stretch fabric, or a cotton fabric? Cotton would probably be best because we don't want a see-through shirt, for one, and two, a stretch won't really accommodate this design. So a cotton of a light to medium weight will be perfect to create a nice summer shirt out of. Different fabrics require different cutting and sewing techniques. We are now going to go through a few popular fabrics, and I will give you some valuable tips to keep in mind when working with these types of fabrics. Starting with natural materials like cottons and linens, which are usually the easiest to sew, so a definite go-to for beginners. Let's look at the cutting instructions first. Now, there are no real requirements unless the fabric has a nap or a pattern on it, influencing the pattern placement. For sewing natural fabrics, use all-purpose cotton or polyester thread the same color or slightly darker than the color of the fabric. You can also use normal machine needles to sew with, and when it comes to pressing, remember to press with steam. Some synthetic fabrics are 100% man-made and some are natural polymers like rayons. Either way, these are also quite easy to work with depending on the weight, like natural fabrics. Just like natural fabrics, there are no real requirements unless the fabric has a nap or a pattern influencing the pattern placement, so you can really just cut away. For sewing synthetic fabrics, use all-purpose cotton or polyester thread the same color or slightly darker than the color of the fabric. Use normal machine needles and press on a cool setting to avoid melting any of the fibers. Silks and satins are usually used for evening wear and can be damaged really quickly, so it is important to handle these precious fabrics with lots of love and care. So when cutting out these precious fabrics, use a nap layout due to the shine, and depending on weight, stabilize fabric with paper underneath. When sewing, use a polyester thread and also use a sharp and thin sewing needle. And use a pressing cloth over fabric when steaming and pressing to avoid damaging or staining the fabric. Because of the way it is constructed, knitted and stretched fabrics require special construction techniques. But don't worry, we are going to discuss them now and I will give you a few tips too. So the most important thing to remember is to not move or stretch the fabric during the pinning and cutting of the pattern, as this will distort the grain and influence the fit of the garment. It is best to use a polyester or nylon thread when sewing garments that stretch with the body like swimwear or sportswear. Try and use an elasticated thread. When it comes to needles, use a ballpoint needle when sewing, and use an overlocker to sew seams together and a cover seam machine for the hem of the garment. Tips for knitted and stretched fabric include to rather press the seam with steam than just pressing the seam, as this will not be enough to stabilize the seam. And when adding fastenings such as zips and button stands out of stretched fabric, always stabilize the fabric with interlining, as this will prevent it from stretching and distorting the garment. Let's talk a bit about sewing transparent fabric. The difficulty depends on the weight of the fabric. You get medium weight fabrics such as cottons and silks that are transparent, which are easier to sew than the soft transparent fabrics like chiffons and georgettes. So, cutting instructions for transparent fabric. The general rule for cutting transparent fabric is the softer the fabric, the more time and space is required. When creating the layout, pin the fabric to a big piece of pattern paper before pinning the pattern pieces on the fabric. The paper underneath the fabric will stabilize the soft fabric and avoid any distorting. And when it comes to sewing instructions, use a fine and sharp machine needle. The finer, the sharper, the better. Reduce the stitch length on your machine. Use a cotton or polyester thread that is an exact match to the color of the fabric, as you will see it. Now, this is a little bit different than the others, where I say you can use a darker color. But because this garment will be see-through, you would want to match your color exactly to the color of the fabric. And because the fabric is transparent, you need to make sure that the inside is as neat as the outside. Consider using binding or French seams to work off the seams inside. And then some tips for transparent fabrics. Always press the seams with a dry iron. Always test a swatch first though. It is also a good idea to press with a cloth on top of your fabric to avoid burning or staining the delicate transparent fabrics. Now, I don't know if you have noticed, but all of these different fabrics require different cutting and sewing techniques. So, what does this mean for mixing fabrics? When it comes to mixing colors and textures, you have free reign. But you have to be careful when you are mixing different weights of fabric and woven fabrics with stretch fabrics. Let me tell you why. Even though it may create an interesting visual effect, mixing weights can be quite a tricky process, as this may result in pulling and distorting the fabric in some way or another, as the fabrics are not compatible, often resulting in ill-fitting garments. Just like mixing different weights, mixing a non-stretch fabric with a stretch can be tricky as well. When sewing, and especially when sewing a piece of stretch fabric into a piece of woven fabric, the stretch fabric may stretch more than necessary, creating an ill-fitting garment. When washed, we already know that woven fabrics generally shrinks a bit and the stretch expands. To avoid this, always pre-wash your fabrics. This is a big must. Also make sure to switch between the appropriate sewing techniques for each fabric. So let's say you're mixing a stretch with a woven fabric. Make sure that you are using the correct techniques on the woven fabric and switching to stretch techniques and changing your needle to a ballpoint needle and maybe changing the thread as well when you're working on the stretch fabric. Let's compare fashion design or owning a brand to a fashion show. In the front, you have the lights, the stage, the cameras, the stunning models wearing the most beautiful creations. But what you don't know is that backstage, it is all business. It is getting the models ready for the runway, fittings and getting dressed, makeup, worrying about timings and how the audience will react to the collection. How is this like owning a brand? Well, even though fashion design is one of the more creative jobs, business forms a big part of it. In the next lesson, I am going to teach you how to make money while living your dream, allowing you to have the best job in the world. Let's take a look at the garment construction process. Do you remember how to analyze a sketch? First, you need to study your sketch and identify all of the design elements. Then you also need to identify the 3 pattern-making techniques you need to apply to create your design, which we discussed in the previous lesson. You already know that the analysis of the design will help you with pattern making. But did you know that it will also help you with garment construction? How? If you can break a garment up into sections and really look at the anatomy of the garment, it enables you to make an informed decision regarding the order of construction. This is incredibly important as it can influence the quality of the final garment significantly. So, for an example, let's look at the anatomy of the men's shirt. A shirt may look simple, but in reality, it is quite a complex piece of clothing consisting of several parts with some tricky terms. Let's start by looking at the front. First, we can see the collar stand. Now, this is the base of the collar. It is the band that is sewn into the neckline. This is usually quite stiff. The stiffness is achieved by using interfacing or interlining. Then you get the collar fall, which is sewn into the collar stand and folded over. The shape of the collar may change depending on the design, but the collar will always consist of these 2 pieces, a collar stand and a collar fall. Next is the yoke, which is a shaped star line just below the shoulder line. Usually, the shoulder line is moved towards the front, creating that line, but the yoke can also be split into 2 pieces. This gives quite a lot of structure to the garment, as this part is also fused and lined. Then we get our armhole, which you already know is the opening which the sleeve is sewn into. Which brings me to the sleeve. On classic or tailored men's shirts, the sleeve will most likely have a cuff at the end. Now, for those who don't know, a cuff is a wide band used to finish the hem of the sleeve. And finally, for the front is the button stand. Both sides will have a button stand, but the one side will have buttons sewn on, and the other side will feature the buttonholes. Before we look at the back, I was wondering, have you ever tried something on and found that the buttons or the fly of the pants, the zip of the pants, were on the wrong side of the garment? Well, even though fashion has progressed quite a bit, Fastenings such as buttons are sewn on the right side for men and on the left side for women. You are probably wondering why. Well, most historians believe that during the Renaissance and Victorian era, rich women did not dress themselves. To make it easier for the servants, the fastenings were placed on the left side. But why would men's buttons be on the right then? This may be due to the military uniforms at the time. Men drew their weapons with their right hand, which meant their left hand was free to open, close, and adjust the buttons. Due to mass production of clothing, these designs are now considered standard. This, however, is still being researched, but it is so interesting, don't you agree? Now let's move on to the back of the shirt. First, we see the back yoke, which again provides structure. Sometimes shirts will feature a box pleat or an inverted pleat at the center back sewn into the yoke line. We can also see some darts on the back that provide shape and creates a better fit. And now that little thingy on the shirt is called a gauntlet. This enables the wearer to easily open the placket for dressing and undressing and also provides durability. The sleeve placket is an opening in the shirt sleeve that generally comes with buttons to help secure the opening in place once it is on the body. And lastly, the hem of the shirt, which is the finished edge at the bottom. The back of a classic shirt is usually a bit longer, and that longer bit we call the tail of the shirt. Like I said before, analyzing the design will help you determine the order of construction. But is the order really that important? Let's pretend we are making a pizza. You have your base, your ingredients, your sauce, and your cheese, right? It does not really matter how you put the pizza together, it will still be delicious, but it might not look that neat and it might also not be as easy to eat. There is a reason the sauce goes on top of the base to give it enough moisture, and the cheese goes on top to keep all the ingredients from falling off, right? Now, just like a pizza, if you have to throw a garment together without thinking about the order, it might still look pretty, but the quality and overall fit will be compromised. The correct order of construction thus improves the fit, the quality, and the overall look of the design, and it also creates ease of sewing. Before we look at an example, let's look at the overall construction process so that we can determine how the garment construction order will fall into place. First, you have to create the design and then the pattern for it by either using flat pattern making techniques or draping it on the dress form. You then have to create the mock to check the design and the fit of the design and alter it where or if necessary. So this is more the creative part of the design process, right? When you are happy with your design, you can prepare your fabric by pre-washing and pressing it and cut out your pattern. Here you will calculate the rating. This garment will then be your prototype. Now the construction begins, and you will do this in a certain order. After you have completed the garment, it will go through a quality check process, and this involves checking that all the seams are neatly worked off and that everything matches up. Last but not least, you will take all the information you have about the garment, including how much it costs and how much time you have spent on it to calculate the selling price of the garment. Let's go through this whole process again, but use a skirt as an example. Are you guys ready? I hope so. Right, let's look at the design of the skirt first. First, we have to study the sketch. We can see that it is a mini skirt with a front yoke, darts at the front and the back with a center zip. When it comes to identifying the pattern making techniques, we can see a bit of dart manipulation and contouring at the yoke waistband. Now that we know that, we can draft our pattern. So here we have taken our basic skirt pattern and indicated our plotting lines on it. Next to the basic block, you can see how I have closed the dart on the yoke to create one piece. The bottom part of the dart will still feature on the bottom part of the skirt. Now, to determine the fabric, we need to study the sketch again. We can see it is quite a structured skirt, so a medium to heavyweight fabric would be best, especially if it has a yoke. I would recommend a cotton twill fabric. Because it is a natural fabric, we need to pre-wash it to avoid any shrinkage, take away any leftover chemicals, and press it before we cut the pattern out. Now, to cut the pattern, we need to determine our layout. Let's say we have found a beautiful cotton twill with a small print. How would we place the pattern? Since it is a repeated small print, I am not too concerned about matching it up, so I will create a double fold layout with my front yoke and front bottom on the fold. Once you have determined your rating and cut out your pattern, you can construct the garment, but before that, you need to determine the order of construction. So let's go through this together. First, you can sew the front darts and the back darts. Then you can sew the back seam and sew in your centered zip. Then you can construct the yoke, and once you have completed that, you can sew the side seams together. Lastly, you can finish the waist and the hem of the garment by working it off neatly. Now that you know the order, you can thread your machine with a color the same or slightly darker than your fabric and start sewing your skirt. I hope that whenever you feel a little stuck, you will remember to break your project down into smaller bits. This technique does not only work with garment construction, but with most things in life. For your lesson today, I want you to analyze the technical drawing you can see on your screen to identify the different parts of the garment. Like always, if you want to share your challenge, you can post it on your favorite social media channels or our Shaw Academy Fashion Design Facebook group. Guys, you have come so far since the very first lesson, I can almost not believe it. You have built a strong foundation of fashion theory that will help you develop your own design style. You have learned how to express yourself and your designs through hand and digital illustrations. You know what a collection is and how to present it. You know the basics of pattern making and how to manipulate it. When it comes to construction, you understand what it takes to take the design from paper to the body. So congratulations for learning all of these things in such a short period of time. You can really be proud of yourself. And just like that, we are done with the third lesson of your last module. Well done, guys. I'm super impressed that you have made it this far. Thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you for lesson 4, the business of fashion. Sometimes sewing a whole garment sounds very overwhelming, but if you break it up into sections, it becomes achievable. Determining the order is thus so important, both for quality and to give you the confidence to really tackle the task. Someone once stopped me in the street and asked me if they can take a photo of my jacket. After they took the photo, the woman asked me where I got it, and my answer was simple. I made it. That feeling, the pride, the confidence, the happiness is something I want all of you guys to feel. So go out and make some amazing stuff, because I know you all have the ability to make showstoppers and be amazing fashion designers. Until next time, as always, stay fashionable.